Hello everyone, and welcome to the Midnight Storyteller. If you're new here, welcome. If you're back, it's good to have you. Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, let's begin.
The storm outside howled against the windows as Mark sat alone in his apartment, the dim glow of his laptop screen the only source of light. It had been a long day, and he was about to turn in for the night when his phone vibrated on the table. A single text message lit up the screen. "Look outside." His heart skipped a beat. The message had no sender. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he hesitated to reply. A prank, maybe? Someone messing with him? He slowly turned his head toward the window, his pulse quickening. The street below was empty. Rain slicked the pavement, reflecting the flickering streetlights. No one was there, just the wind pushing against the trees, their shadows swaying unnaturally. Then his phone vibrated again. "I see you." Mark felt a cold chill creep up his spine. His eyes darted around the room, scanning the dark corners. Was someone watching him? His apartment was on the 3rd floor. How could anyone be outside his window? He forced out a shaky breath and typed back, "Who is this?" No response. Only silence. He grabbed his phone and stood up, cautiously approaching the window. He pressed his face to the cold glass, scanning the street once more. The empty road stretched into the distance. No cars, no people, nothing. Then his screen lit up again. "You're looking the wrong way." Mark spun around so fast he nearly fell backward. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes darted across the room. The closet door was slightly open. He hadn't left it that way. He was sure of it. His fingers tightened around his phone as he slowly approached the closet, the wooden floor creaking beneath his weight. His own breathing sounded too loud in the quiet apartment. He reached out, hand trembling, and yanked the door open. Nothing. Just his clothes hanging limply on their racks. The darkness inside felt heavier than it should. He exhaled shakily, letting out a nervous chuckle. Just then another message came through. Too slow. Mark's blood turned to ice. A sharp creak echoed behind him, the sound of a footstep. He turned just in time to see movement in the reflection of his bedroom mirror. A figure. Tall. Gaunt. Its face was wrong, distorted, stretched too wide in a grotesque grin. Its hollow eyes locked onto his, and before Mark could even scream, the figure lunged. Darkness swallowed him whole. The next morning, Mark's apartment was quiet. The storm had passed. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. His phone lay abandoned on the table, the screen cracked. A single message remained open. "Found you." But Mark was gone. His apartment was empty, as if he had never been there at all. The old house on the corner of Maple Street had always been there, standing like a forgotten relic, its paint peeling, windows clouded with dust. No one ever moved in. No one ever moved out. It just existed. One night, Olivia walked past it on her way home. The wind carried a faint whisper through the trees, something almost like her name. She paused, glancing toward the house. The porch light was on, but the house had been abandoned for years. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from an unknown number. "Come inside." Her breath hitched. She turned sharply, scanning the street. Empty. A chill ran down her spine, but she told herself it was nothing, just a prank, a coincidence. She picked up her pace, determined to ignore the unease creeping up her back. Then the second message came. "Don't run." She did. Her heart pounded as she sprinted down the sidewalk, her footsteps echoing against the quiet night. The streetlights flickered. The wind howled. When she reached her apartment, she fumbled with her keys, shoved open the door, and slammed it behind her. Safe. She let out a shaky breath, pressing her forehead against the cool wood. Her phone buzzed again. "You're home." "Good." Her stomach dropped. Slowly she turned. The apartment was dark, exactly as she had left it. Nothing was out of place. But something felt wrong. She locked the door, double-checking it before backing away, her eyes darting to the windows. Then she saw it. A figure. Standing just outside her window. She froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at her. She took a step back. Her phone slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud. The figure moved. Not forward, not to the side. It glitched. 1 second, it was outside. The next, it was inside. Olivia stumbled backward, a scream rising in her throat. The figure stood just a few feet away now, its face shrouded in shadow. Her phone vibrated once more. With shaking hands, she picked it up. Too late. The lights flickered, the shadows twisted, and then darkness. The next morning, Olivia's apartment door stood ajar. Her phone lay on the floor, the screen cracked, the last message still glowing. But Olivia was gone. And the house on Maple Street? Its porch light was off, waiting. The moment he stepped into the alley, the strange sensation washed over him. The feeling of being watched. It was late, and the city was quiet, but something about the dimly lit street made him uneasy. His eyes darted around, scanning the shadows, but there was no one there. Just the faint hum of streetlights and the distant sound of traffic. But that feeling, the creeping sensation at the back of his neck, wouldn't go away. He quickened his pace, his footsteps echoing in the narrow space between the crumbling buildings. As he walked, the alley seemed to stretch, the walls closing in on him. He looked over his shoulder again, feeling the presence of someone following him. But no one was there. It wasn't until he reached the end of the alley that he noticed something strange. A small door, half hidden behind a stack of old crates. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but the rusted handle beckoned him. Without thinking, he reached for it. The door creaked open, revealing a small room. His curiosity piqued, he stepped inside. The room was dark and musty, with only a single light bulb swinging above. Dust hung thick in the air, and the floor was littered with discarded items, a broken chair, a pile of old newspapers, and something that looked like a bundle of clothes. He squinted, trying to make out the details. But before he could take another step, the door slammed shut behind him. The sudden noise sent a shock of adrenaline through his body. He spun around, trying to open the door, but it was locked. Panic surged as he tugged at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. That's when he heard the noise, the soft shuffle of footsteps behind him. His heart raced as he slowly turned around. In the corner of the room, a figure stood motionless. He couldn't make out any features, just the outline of a person. His breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped forward, revealing a face that made his stomach churn. It was a face he recognized, but it wasn't his own. The figure's eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to stare right through him. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and the corners of its mouth curled into an eerie smile. He took a step back, stumbling over a pile of old crates. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure said, its voice low and rasping, like it had been buried for years. The room seemed to shrink as the figure took another step forward. His mind raced. He had to get out of there. But no matter where he turned, the figure was always there, its empty eyes locked onto him. The smell of decay hit him then, a sickening, overpowering stench that made his stomach twist. He turned again, his fingers trembling as they scrambled over the door handle. But still it wouldn't open. The figure moved closer, its face now just inches from his. He could feel its cold breath on his skin, sending a chill down his spine. "You should have stayed away," it whispered, its voice almost a growl. He tried to fight, to push the figure away, but his hands passed right through it, like it wasn't even real. His mind spun, panic setting in as he realized something far more terrifying. This wasn't a person. It wasn't even human. With a final guttural laugh, the figure reached out and touched his face. The world around him blurred, spinning wildly, until he collapsed onto the cold, dusty floor. The last thing he saw before his vision faded was the figure standing over him, its hollow eyes now staring down with a twisted satisfaction. When he woke up, the alley was gone. The room was gone. He was back in his apartment, drenched in sweat, gasping for air. He looked around, his heart pounding in his chest. The door to his room was still locked, just like it always was. But something was wrong. Something in the air felt heavy, thick with the same oppressive presence he had felt in that room. He ran to the mirror, trying to shake the feeling off, but when he looked into it, his reflection wasn't his own. Instead, the hollow-eyed figure stared back at him, a grin stretching across its face. The same twisted smile, and it was smiling at him, because it had finally found him. It started with the knocking. Soft at first, just a gentle tap, tap, tap against the bedroom window. Mia ignored it, assuming it was the wind or maybe a stray branch scraping the glass. But the next night, it came again. Tap, tap, tap. She lived on the 4th floor. There were no trees near her window. That was the first time she felt it, the creeping sensation of being watched. She tried to rationalize it, maybe a bird, maybe the pipes in the walls. But deep down, something felt wrong. The knocks weren't random. They came in patterns. 3 taps, a pause, 3 more taps, like someone was trying to get her attention. One night, curiosity got the better of her. She turned off her bedroom light and crept toward the window, heart pounding. The city outside was quiet, bathed in pale moonlight. Nothing seemed out of place, and then she saw it, a face. Pale, gaunt, pressed against the glass from the outside. Its eyes were wide, black pits, and its mouth was twisted into a grin too large for its face. Mia's breath caught in her throat. It was upside down, like it was hanging from the roof. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her bed. When she looked again, nothing. Just the empty night sky. Had she imagined it? She barely slept, every nerve on edge. But for a while the knocking stopped, until a week later. She was brushing her teeth, the steam from her shower fogging up the bathroom mirror. She wiped it with her hand, expecting to see her own reflection staring back. Instead, she saw him, the same hollow-eyed man from the window, standing behind her, grinning. She screamed and spun around. Nothing. Just the empty bathroom. The mirror was completely fogged over again. She should have left then. Packed her bags, run. But she convinced herself it was just stress, lack of sleep. The mind plays tricks, right? That night, she locked her bedroom door. Pulled the covers over her head, tried to block it all out. But at 3 a.m., the knocking returned. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the window, it was coming from inside her closet. Tap, tap, tap. Slow. Deliberate. Mia's breath hitched. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself not to move, not to breathe. Then, the door creaked open. She felt it. The air shifted, the temperature dropped, something was in the room with her. And then, a whisper, right next to her ear. I let myself in. Mia shot out of bed, scrambling for the light switch. When she flipped it on, the room was empty. The closet door was wide open. But something was wrong. The window was now unlocked, and in the reflection of the glass, a grin too wide, eyes too dark, he was already inside. The sun had long disappeared behind the horizon, and the small town of Glenmore had already settled into the quiet that came with the late hours of the night. But something was different tonight. A lingering sense of unease hung in the air, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. Emma, a newcomer to the town, had been warned about the old house at the end of Maple Street. Stay away from it, they said. No one dares go near it. But Emma, curious and skeptical of local superstition, decided to take a walk that evening and see the house for herself. She had heard the stories, the ones about the house being haunted, about strange occurrences that would send shivers down anyone's spine. But Emma wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories. She had always been rational, always sought logical explanations for anything that couldn't be easily understood. So when she arrived at the house, she stood across the street, peering at the eerie silhouette outlined against the moonlit sky. The house was massive, its dark windows like eyes that seemed to watch her every move. The exterior was decaying, with the once grand facade now covered in ivy and grime. The air around it felt heavier than it should have, like something was pressing in on her from all sides. Emma scoffed, shaking her head. Just an old house, she thought. Nothing more. She crossed the street slowly, her footsteps muffled by the dense grass growing wild around the yard. As she got closer, the unsettling feeling only grew stronger, as though the house was calling out to her. She could almost feel the weight of its history pressing on her chest, the secrets it held behind its crumbling walls. But Emma was determined. She stepped up to the front door, which was slightly ajar, as if inviting her in. Without thinking, she pushed it open and stepped inside. The musty scent of mold and dust filled her nose, and the sound of creaking wood echoed through the halls. The floor beneath her feet groaned with each step she took, as if the house itself was alive, shifting with every movement. The air was thick with a strange stillness, the kind of quiet that made her feel as though she were intruding on something she wasn't meant to see. As she ventured deeper into the house, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The temperature in the room seemed to drop with each step, and her breath became visible in the air. She glanced over her shoulder. half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but there was no one there. "It's just my imagination," she told herself. But then she heard it. A faint whisper, almost imperceptible, like a voice carried on the wind. She froze, her heart racing in her chest. The whisper was followed by another, clearer this time, and then another. The words were indistinguishable, but the tone, there was something desperate about it, something pleading. Emma's skin prickled with a cold sweat as the whispers grew louder, more urgent. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside. She spun around, her pulse pounding in her ears. She tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through her veins as the whispers grew louder, now unmistakable. They were calling her name. "Emma!" A chill ran down her spine. Her breath hitched in her throat as she stumbled backward, her back hitting the wall. She could feel the weight of invisible eyes on her, as though the house itself was aware of her presence and watching her every move. The walls seemed to close in on her, the air thickening, the floor beneath her feet trembling. And then, in the dim light, she saw them. Shadows moving along the edges of the room. At first, they were nothing more than flickers in the corner of her vision. But soon they took shape, becoming more defined with each passing second. Figures, ghostly, translucent, but unmistakable, began to emerge from the dark corners of the room. They were people, or at least they had once been. Their faces were contorted in expressions of agony, their eyes hollow, vacant. They floated toward her, their movements jerky and unnatural, as though they were struggling to break free from some unseen force. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. She tried to move, but her legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. The figures closed in on her, their outstretched hands reaching for her with terrifying speed. She could feel the coldness radiating from them, the oppressive energy that surrounded them. One of the figures, a woman, stepped forward, her eyes fixed on Emma's with an intensity that made her blood run cold. The woman's mouth opened, but instead of words, a low, guttural sound emerged, like a whisper from deep within the earth. "Leave, now, or you'll stay." Emma's eyes widened in horror as she realized the terrifying truth. The house wasn't just haunted. It was a prison for the souls of those who had entered it, never to leave. And now she had become one of them. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as the figures closed in, their hands brushing against her skin. She could feel the chill of death, the suffocating presence of the house wrapping itself around her like a vice. And just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, she heard one last whisper. This time, not from the figures, but from somewhere else, somewhere deep within the house. "Welcome home." In that moment, Emma realized she was never meant to leave. The house had claimed her, just as it had claimed everyone before her. The door to the house remained shut, and no one would ever hear from Emma again.
The car had been behind him for weeks, trailing him wherever he went. At first, it was just a coincidence. It seemed like a harmless, ordinary vehicle. A grey sedan with tinted windows, nothing out of the ordinary. But after a few days, Michael began to notice the pattern. Every time he left his house, the car was there, waiting a few cars behind him, moving at the same pace. No matter what route he took, no matter how many turns he made, the car would always be there. Michael tried to shake off the feeling of unease. He was probably just being paranoid. Right, it wasn't unusual for drivers to take the same routes. Maybe it was someone from his neighborhood, or just a random person with similar travel plans. He told himself that he was overthinking it, trying to convince himself that there was no real threat. But it didn't stop. The car was always there. He'd been working late at his office downtown when it first happened. The streetlights flickered as he pulled out of the parking garage, his tired eyes scanning the road ahead. He had planned to grab a late dinner from his usual spot, but the feeling of being followed, of being watched, made him uneasy. As he turned onto the main street, he noticed the car for the first time. It wasn't particularly close, but it was there. A few cars behind him, moving at the same speed. At first, he brushed it off. He made a left turn, and the car followed. Then another left. The car stayed behind him, never too close, but always there, maintaining the same distance, no matter how many turns he took. Michael's heart began to race, as his mind started to race with questions. Was it just a coincidence, or was someone following him? He decided to take an unfamiliar route home, hoping to lose the car in the maze of downtown streets. He turned right, then left, then right again, but every time he glanced in his rearview mirror, the gray sedan was still there, its headlights illuminating the dark road behind him. He couldn't escape it. The car never deviated from his path. It was almost like it was deliberately staying close, no matter what. By the time he reached his apartment building, the car was still there. He pulled into the parking garage, and for a moment, he thought he might be free. But when he got out of his car, he caught a glimpse of the sedan parked across the lot, facing his vehicle. His stomach dropped. The car hadn't just been following him. It had parked in the same garage, just far enough away to remain unnoticed until now. Panic set in as Michael rushed into his building, locking the door behind him and trying to calm his shaking hands. He convinced himself that he was being ridiculous. Maybe the driver lived in the same building. Maybe they were just as tired as he was, and their paths happened to cross. It was all just a coincidence. But the next night, the car was there again. This time, Michael didn't take his usual route. He made several detours, hoping to shake off the sedan, but the car was always a few steps behind, patiently following him through the streets. His anxiety grew as he realized there was no escaping it. The car never sped up, never overtook him. It simply followed, as if waiting for him to slip up, to make a mistake. Every time he checked his rearview mirror, he saw those headlights glaring back at him, unwavering. His nerves were shot. The oppressive silence of the night made his thoughts race with fear and confusion. Why was someone following him? What did they want? Michael tried to ignore it for a while, but it was impossible. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He even tried driving in circles, taking random streets just to test whether the car would still follow him. It did, every single time. Eventually Michael pulled into a public parking lot, hoping that the change of scenery would discourage whoever was following him. He parked far from the entrance, sat in his car, and waited. The sedan didn't drive past. Instead, it parked a few spaces away from him. Facing his car, Michael's breath hitched. He wasn't sure what to do. He glanced around, trying to make sense of the situation. The lot was mostly empty, the few remaining cars parked along the outer edges, but there was no sign of the person who had been driving the sedan. He was alone with his thoughts, his mind buzzing with possibilities, none of them comforting. He couldn't just sit here forever. He needed answers. He grabbed his phone and snapped a picture of the car, its license plate barely visible in the dim light. The flash from his phone briefly illuminated the scene, and as the bright light flickered in the darkness, Michael saw something he hadn't noticed before. A figure sitting in the front seat of the sedan, motionless. His heart skipped a beat. Who was that? What were they doing? Before he could make a move, the figure in the car seemed to stir. The headlights of the sedan flickered on, and Michael's blood ran cold. The car slowly began to back up, then turned sharply to leave the lot. As it passed, Michael's eyes locked onto the rearview mirror, where the dark figure's face stared back at him. The person didn't even blink. The following days were filled with dread. Michael couldn't stop looking over his shoulder. Every time he left his apartment, he checked the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that gray sedan again. But for several days, there was nothing. He thought he was finally free from whatever or whoever had been following him. But one night, as he was driving home from work, the familiar headlights appeared again. This time, Michael couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't just let this go. He needed to know who was behind the wheel, why they were following him, and what they wanted. He made up his mind. he would confront the driver. He turned onto a side street and parked his car, waiting for the sedan to catch up. The street was eerily quiet, the only sound being the hum of the tires against the road. Michael's hands were sweaty on the steering wheel, his mind racing with possibilities. What if the driver was dangerous? What if they had been following him for some sinister reason? The sedan approached, its headlights glaring brightly against the dark night. As it passed him, Michael acted quickly. He slammed his foot on the gas, driving his car in front of the gray sedan, blocking its path. He put the car in park and got out, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, the sedan didn't move. It just sat there, the engine idling. Michael's mind screamed at him to get back in the car, to drive away, but his body didn't listen. He walked toward the sedan, determined to face whatever or whoever was on the other side of the wheel. The moment Michael reached the front of the car, the sedan's headlights flickered off, the door opened, and a figure stepped out. It was a man, tall, with a gaunt face and dark eyes. His expression was cold, almost lifeless. "I'm sorry," the man said, his voice low and hollow. "I didn't mean to frighten you." Michael stood frozen, the words not quite reaching him. The man had been following him all this time. But why? Who was he? The man stepped closer. "I've been waiting for you to notice me." Before Michael could react, the man spoke again. "But now, it's your turn to follow me." It was supposed to be a quiet evening, a much-needed escape from the grind of the workday. Jared had just come home, after a long shift at the office, and looked forward to a relaxing shower. He hadn't even taken his shoes off yet, when he heard the faint sound of water running. At first, he figured it was just the neighbor's shower, or maybe his washing machine. But then he froze. The sound was coming from the bathroom. His apartment was small, and every noise seemed amplified. The echo of the running water felt louder now that he was paying attention to it. Jared stood still, his muscles tense, as he tried to gather his thoughts. The sound was unmistakable. Water running. Someone was in the shower. But that was impossible. He lived alone. No one else had a key to his apartment. He was sure of it. Curiosity gnawed at him, but caution held him back. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe the faucet was leaking, or something strange had happened, and it wasn't what he thought. But it was so real, so immediate. Jared couldn't dismiss it as just his mind playing tricks on him. He had to check. With slow, careful steps, he made his way to the bathroom door. The sound of the water running grew louder as he approached, and his heart began to pound in his chest. His hand hovered over the doorknob. The bathroom door was closed, but the light was on. He hadn't left the light on when he left earlier that morning. A shiver ran down his spine as he slowly turned the handle. The moment the door creaked open, the sound of the running water ceased. Jared's breath caught in his throat. The silence was deafening now. His mind screamed for him to leave, to turn and walk away from the unsettling scene that lay behind that door. But he couldn't move. The bathroom was empty. The shower curtain was drawn tightly, as it always was when Jared took a shower, and the bathroom mirror reflected nothing out of the ordinary. His towels were neatly stacked, his toiletries in their usual places, but everything felt wrong. The bathroom was too quiet, the air too still. It was like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Jared's eyes locked onto the shower curtain. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind it, something just out of sight. He had never been afraid of the dark, but now, he felt a cold, unfamiliar fear creeping over him. He needed to know what was causing the sound, needed to see with his own eyes that there was nothing there, that his mind was just playing tricks on him. He took a deep breath, and without thinking, he grabbed the shower curtain and yanked it open. The bathroom light flickered for a moment, casting strange shadows on the walls, but there was nothing in the tub. No one, nothing out of place. He exhaled in relief, his heart still racing, but at least he had the answer. It was just his imagination. Jared stood there for a few moments, trying to calm his frayed nerves. But as he reached for the light switch to turn off the overhead bulb, something caught his eye in the reflection of the bathroom mirror. A shadow moved. He whipped his head back toward the shower, but nothing was there. He took a step back, eyes darting around the room, his pulse quickening once more. The shadow hadn't been his own. He was sure of it. His reflection in the mirror hadn't moved at all, but the shadow had been different, slightly distorted, as though something was just behind him. He was alone, right? He turned around quickly, his back now pressed against the cold bathroom sink. The bathroom was completely still, too still. His breath caught in his throat. His eyes scanned the room, looking for any sign that could explain what had just happened. He stood there, listening, but all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart. Just as he started to relax and let his guard down, Jared heard it, a soft, faint sound coming from the shower. It was the unmistakable sound of water running again. He hadn't imagined it this time. It was there, as real as the breath in his lungs. He stepped toward the shower cautiously, his hands shaking, as he reached out for the curtain once more. His mind screamed at him to stop, to leave it alone, but the curiosity was overpowering, the need for answers relentless. He had to see what was happening. Jared slowly pulled the curtain open again, his eyes darting across the tub, and there it was. The water was running, but there was no one in the tub. It wasn't just that it was running. The water was rising. The bath water was creeping up over the edge of the tub, as though someone had left the faucet on full blast. But no one was there, no one at all. His mind couldn't process it. He reached for the faucet to turn it off, but as soon as his hand grasped the handle, the water stopped rising. It wasn't even flowing anymore. It had simply stopped, as if whatever force had been making it run had been satisfied. And then, the air in the room seemed to shift. The temperature dropped. Jared felt a chill settle in the room, like the walls themselves were becoming colder. The water in the tub was still, stagnant, yet in the silence he could hear something. A soft, steady sound like breathing, deep, measured, almost rhythmic. Jared froze. He knew he wasn't alone. The realization hit him with a wave of terror, but he couldn't move. The sound of breathing, slow and deliberate, filled the room, and it was coming from somewhere close, too close. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes moved toward the bathroom mirror once again. This time something was there, a figure. It wasn't like a reflection, not like something he could recognize or see with clarity. It was a shadowy outline, faint but present. It was standing right behind him. Jared didn't want to turn around. He knew deep down that if he did, whatever it was wouldn't be behind him anymore. It would be in front of him. It would be real, but his body betrayed him. His neck twisted involuntarily, and he faced what was behind him. The moment his eyes met the shadow, the breathing stopped, the air stilled, the shower water ceased to run. Everything was silent. The shadow remained, unmoving, waiting. Jared's heart pounded in his chest. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to flee, but his legs were frozen in place, his body unable to respond. Then, slowly the figure started to move. It was tall, far taller than Jared. The figure moved toward him with a slow, deliberate pace, its form becoming more and more solid. Jared finally snapped into action, his survival instinct taking over. He ran. The cold air of the bathroom no longer mattered. The shadow no longer mattered. He ran down the hallway, through his front door, and out into the parking lot, where he collapsed on the cold concrete, gasping for breath. When he returned to his apartment later that night, everything seemed normal, too normal. The bathroom was just as he had left it, but Jared knew that something had changed, something he couldn't explain. The shadow was still there, lurking in the corners of his mind, waiting for him to return, and he would, sooner or later. It always came back. The night was unusually quiet for a campus that never seemed to sleep. The sound of footsteps echoed across the narrow hallway, the only noise breaking the silence in the late hours of the night. Ethan had just returned from a long night of studying in the library.
His head was heavy, and his eyes begged for rest, but as he walked down the hall to his dorm room, something felt off. His dorm was on the 3rd floor of an old building that had been around for decades. The walls were thin, and the floors creaked as though they had their own stories to tell. Ethan had gotten used to the peculiarities of the building, but tonight felt different. He wasn't sure why, but a strange unease settled in his stomach, a sensation that had grown stronger with each passing step. He approached the door to his room, and stopped. The hall was eerily quiet, too quiet. He glanced at the other rooms along the corridor, but there were no sounds of laughter or talking. Most of the students were probably in their rooms, studying or sleeping. Yet it was more than just the silence that unsettled him. It was the fact that his roommate Josh wasn't there. That wasn't unusual in itself. Josh often stayed out late, sometimes not returning until the early hours of the morning. But tonight, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He unlocked the door to their room and pushed it open, stepping inside. The room was dimly lit by the desk lamp on his side of the room. It was quiet, just like the hall, but it wasn't the silence that caught Ethan's attention. It was the feeling of stillness, of something waiting. His gaze immediately went to Josh's side of the room, but the bed was empty. Ethan set his bag down on the floor and moved toward the desk. He paused as his eyes flicked across the room, scanning for any sign of his roommate. He hadn't seen Josh all evening, and it seemed odd that he hadn't even left a note or mentioned where he was going. But maybe he was just hanging out with friends, doing something normal. Maybe. He glanced at the clock. It was 2:30 a.m., a little late for Josh to be out, but not unheard of. Still, Ethan felt a creeping sense of unease. He decided to take a quick shower to try to shake off the feeling. The water would wash away the exhaustion from his mind. He grabbed a towel and walked toward the bathroom. As he entered the bathroom, the door creaked softly behind him. Ethan stepped into the small, outdated space, feeling a slight chill in the air. The bathroom lights flickered for a brief second, but he dismissed it as nothing more than a minor electrical issue. The shower curtains were closed, and the room smelled faintly of soap. He turned on the water, adjusting the temperature to a warm, relaxing setting, and began to undress. As the water hit his skin, Ethan let out a relieved sigh. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth soak into his tired muscles. For a few minutes, everything felt normal. The quiet hum of the water, the steam rising around him. It was all familiar, peaceful. But then he heard something. It was faint at first, just barely audible. But as the sound continued, Ethan could no longer ignore it. Someone was breathing. Soft, steady breaths, like someone was standing just outside the shower. He froze. For a moment, he convinced himself it was his imagination, a trick his mind was playing after a long day. But the longer he listened, the clearer it became. Someone was definitely standing outside the shower, breathing in slow, rhythmic intervals. Ethan's heart began to pound. He couldn't understand why Josh would be in the bathroom. Josh had always been the kind of person to knock or call out before entering, even in the middle of the night. He never just barged in, and yet, the breathing continued, steady and deliberate. Ethan's mind raced. Was someone else in the room? He considered stepping out of the shower and checking, but the sound of breathing was so close now, so real, that it paralyzed him with fear. His eyes flicked to the edge of the shower curtain, the slight gap between the fabric and the wall. Someone is in the bathroom with me, he thought, his pulse quickening. The sound stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed felt deafening. Ethan's chest tightened as he strained to hear any other sounds. The breathing had stopped, but now he felt like he was being watched. He wasn't alone anymore. He could feel it. Something was there, and it wasn't his roommate. Without thinking, Ethan grabbed the shower curtain and pulled it back in one swift motion. His heart dropped into his stomach. The bathroom was empty. There was no one there. Ethan stood frozen, dripping wet, his mind racing. There was no one in the room. He had been alone, hadn't he? The sound of breathing, the feeling of someone being there, all of it. It couldn't have been real. He wasn't imagining it, though. It had been so vivid, so real, that he couldn't brush it off as a figment of his imagination. He quickly finished his shower, his heart still pounding in his chest. When he stepped out of the bathroom, Ethan quickly wrapped a towel around himself and moved back into the main room, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. He glanced at Josh's bed again, and that's when he noticed something strange. Josh's laptop was open on the desk, but it was covered in a layer of dust. Ethan felt his stomach twist. His roommate always kept his laptop close, never leaving it unattended like that. Then, he noticed the note on the desk. It wasn't from Josh though. It was written in neat, precise handwriting. Definitely not Josh's. Ethan's fingers trembled as he picked it up. The note read, "You're next. You're next." His blood ran cold. His mind whirled. Who could have left this here? He didn't know anyone who would do something like that. Ethan's fear deepened. The atmosphere in the room felt thick, like it was closing in on him. He rushed to the door and locked it, his mind racing. But when he glanced at the clock again, it was 3:15 a.m. Where had the time gone? He took a deep breath and tried to calm himself. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe it was just a prank, something harmless. But the message on the note, the breathing in the bathroom, it all pointed to something much more sinister. Ethan sat on his bed, his towel still around his waist, staring at the door. The silence was heavy, oppressive. It felt like something was watching him from the corners of the room. The oppressive, suffocating feeling wouldn't go away. Something had changed in that room. He wasn't just afraid. He was terrified. Minutes stretched into hours. At 4 a.m., Ethan decided to check on Josh. He needed answers, needed to make sense of the strange events. He grabbed his phone and called his roommate, but the line was dead. His phone had no signal. Panic set in as he realized that his room was no longer a sanctuary. The note, the breathing, the empty room, it all pointed to one undeniable truth. He wasn't safe. Ethan had no choice but to leave. He grabbed his things in a frenzy, his mind still racing. As he opened the door to leave, he turned to look back at the room one last time. He could have sworn he saw Josh standing there, staring at him from the corner. But when Ethan turned back around, the figure was gone.
The smell hit them first. It wasn't just the stench of decay, it was something worse, something that crawled into your lungs and stayed there, thick and putrid. The officer standing at the doorway gagged, covering his nose with his sleeve. They all knew something terrible was waiting inside, but none of them were prepared for what they were about to find. The house was silent, except for the faint creaking of floorboards under their boots. The walls were lined with old, yellowed wallpaper, peeling in places. The furniture was covered in dust, as if no one had lived there for years. But someone had, and that someone had left behind something monstrous. They found the first one in the living room. A body, or what was left of it, was propped up in a chair. The skin was stretched too tightly over its frame, stitched together crudely, like a macabre piece of art. But it wasn't just skin. The officers' stomachs twisted as they realized what they were looking at. It was a suit made from human flesh. The second body was in the kitchen. This one wasn't displayed like the first. It was discarded, carelessly dumped in the corner, its torso completely skinned. The missing flesh had been used. The lid detective forced himself to breathe. They had heard stories, rumors about the man who lived here, whispers of missing people who were last seen near this house. But no one had ever proven anything. Until now. They moved deeper into the house, their hands gripping their guns tightly. Then they heard it. A soft, wet squelching sound. It was coming from the basement. No one wanted to go down there. But they had no choice. The stairs groaned under their weight as they descended, flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. The smell grew stronger, nearly unbearable. And then, in the dim light, they saw him. The man was hunched over a wooden work table, his back to them. His hands moved methodically, carefully, as if he were sewing fabric together. Only it wasn't fabric. It was skin, pale, raw, freshly removed. He was making another suit. The moment their lights hit him, he froze. Slowly, he turned around, and he was wearing it. The skin of his latest victim draped over his body like a second layer, stitched together with jagged black thread. The flesh on his face was uneven, mismatched, the mouth twisted in a permanent, grotesque grin. For a moment, no one moved. Then the man smiled. Not through the stolen face, through his own. A twisted, horrifying smile that sent ice through their veins. "You finally found me," he whispered. The silence shattered. The officers lunged forward, shouting commands, but the man didn't run. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he reached for something on the table, a knife, still dripping with blood. They fired. The first bullet hit him in the shoulder. The second in the chest. He stumbled back, his grotesque suit sagging, the stitches pulling apart at the seams. But he was still smiling. Even as he collapsed to the floor, his breathing ragged, he laughed. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said something that would haunt them forever. "This isn't my first skin." His head tilted slightly, his eyes locking onto the detectives. "And it won't be my last." The room fell into suffocating silence. Then, finally, he stopped breathing. The officers stood frozen, staring at the horror before them. But none of them noticed the closet door behind them. None of them heard the faint sound of fabric shifting. None of them saw the extra suit, waiting in the shadows. The little girl woke up to the sound of soft breathing. It was coming from the doorway of her room. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, just the strange noises of the old house settling in the night. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw a shadow standing there. A familiar figure. It was her mother. She stood still in the doorway, her face hidden in the shadows, her posture eerily stiff. The girl, barely 6 years old, felt an instant wave of comfort. Maybe her mom had come to check on her, to make sure she was sleeping soundly. "Mom?" she whispered, her voice groggy from sleep. No response. The figure just stood there, breathing slowly, softly. A small shiver crept up the girl's spine. Something about the silence felt off. "Mom?" she said again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. Then her mother did something strange. She slowly, so very slowly, tilted her head to one side. The movement was unnatural, jerky, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. The little girl felt her stomach twist. Something was wrong. Then, from behind her, she heard the sound of sheets rustling. She turned her head, and there, in the dim light of the moon, she saw her real mother, lying in bed, fast asleep. Her breath caught in her throat. If her mother was right there, then who was standing in the doorway? Her tiny body froze. The shadow in the doorway hadn't moved, but she could still hear the breathing, deep, slow, deliberate. It almost sounded like a whisper, as if the thing was mimicking the sound of her mother's breath. The little girl squeezed her eyes shut. Maybe if she didn't move, it would go away. Maybe she was just dreaming. But then, the breathing got closer. She could hear it now, louder, inches from her bed. Her tiny hands clenched the blanket, pulling it up to her chin. And then, silence. The breathing stopped. The air in the room felt thick, heavy, suffocating. Slowly, heart-pounding, the girl peeked over the edge of her blanket. The doorway was empty. The figure was gone. For a brief moment, relief washed over her. Maybe she really had imagined it. Maybe it was just a trick of the dark, just her sleepy mind playing games. Then she heard it. A whisper. Right next to her ear. "Go back to sleep." A scream lodged in her throat, but before she could make a sound, something cold brushed against her cheek. She bolted upright, her tiny hands shaking as she reached for the lamp beside her bed. The second the light flooded the room, she gasped. The doorway was still empty. The room was still. Her mother was still sound asleep, undisturbed by any of it. The only thing that had changed was her closet door. It was open. Just a crack. And inside that thin sliver of darkness, she saw something. Two pale, glassy eyes staring back at her. She wanted to scream, to cry, to run to her mother's bed, but her body refused to move. She was paralyzed in terror, staring at those unblinking eyes that glowed in the darkness. Then, slowly, excruciatingly slow, the closet door began to close. The eyes disappeared into the darkness. The click of the latch sent a shiver through her bones. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, she told her mother everything. But of course, she didn't believe her. "It was just a nightmare," her mother said, brushing her hair back with a comforting smile. The girl didn't argue. But when her mother left the room, she hesitantly walked toward the closet. Her tiny fingers trembled as she reached for the handle. Slowly, she pulled the door open. Nothing. Just her clothes, her toys, the usual mess of a child's closet. But something felt wrong, and then she saw it. Carved into the wooden wall at the very back of the closet were 3 words, "I was here." She never slept with the closet door open again. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound in the sterile, white-walled room. The hospital felt eerily quiet for a late evening shift, as Dr. Charles Hayden prepared for another night of surgery. He'd done this countless times, and yet, tonight felt different. Maybe it was the dark clouds hovering outside the window, or the growing sense of unease that settled in his stomach. But something was off. He reviewed the file again. A routine surgery. A man named Mark Simmons, mid-30s, no history of complications, coming in for a relatively simple procedure. But as Dr. Hayden glanced at the clock, he realized it was already past midnight, far beyond the hours when normal patients would come in. There was a lingering strangeness in the air, one that he couldn't shake. Mark arrived shortly after, wheeled into the operating room on a gurney by a nurse. He was unconscious, breathing steadily, with no signs of distress. Everything seemed normal. Dr. Hayden spoke to the anesthesiologist, giving the go-ahead for the procedure. He watched as the sedative took effect, the patient's body growing slack with each passing moment. The room filled with the mechanical whir of equipment, and Hayden made his first incision. As he worked, however, something felt strange. The usual rhythm of the surgery was interrupted by a gnawing feeling deep in his gut. Every time he moved, every time the scalpel slid through tissue, his eyes kept drifting back to Mark's face. There was something off about it, something unsettling. He paused, wiping his brow, and looked closer at the monitor. The patient's vital signs were still normal, but there was a slight fluctuation that hadn't been there earlier. Strange, too strange. His heartbeat seems a little erratic, Dr. Hayden muttered under his breath, but the machine didn't indicate any real danger. The rhythm was steady, almost too steady. Minutes passed, and just as Hayden thought everything was back on track, he heard a soft sound from the table. A faint breathing, almost imperceptible, but still there. It couldn't be. The sedative should have kept Mark unconscious, deeply so. He glanced up at the nurse, who seemed unfazed. They'd been in and out of surgeries countless times together, and he had never seen her look so distracted. Her eyes were fixed on the corner of the room, and she seemed to be holding her breath, as though waiting for something. But there was nothing to wait for. This was a routine surgery. As he pressed on, the breathing sound grew louder, more pronounced, almost as though it was coming from Mark's mouth, but not quite. Dr. Hayden's hand faltered. His nerves were playing tricks on him, he told himself. Yet something tugged at him. Something was terribly wrong. It wasn't the kind of noise a sedated patient should make. He took another breath, focused on the incision, trying to push the creeping feeling of dread away. That was when he noticed it. Mark's eyes. They were half open, but it wasn't the soft fluttering of someone in deep sedation. No, these eyes were moving, darting underneath the lids, trying to open. A chill ran down Dr. Hayden's spine. "Something's wrong," he muttered under his breath, stepping back. He called out to the nurse. "Can you check on the monitors? Something doesn't feel right." The nurse didn't respond, still frozen in place, her eyes glued to the same corner of the room. Dr. Hayden turned to look, but saw nothing there. No shadow, no movement, just the flickering lights above. His pulse quickened. The room suddenly felt too small. The walls seemed to close in as the air grew thick and stifling. He turned back to Mark, but the patient's eyes had shifted, no longer trapped under the lids, but wide open, staring directly at him. A rush of panic surged through his chest. "Mark?" Dr. Hayden whispered, stepping closer. But the patient's eyes didn't blink. They didn't shift. They just stared. Then the strangest thing happened. Mark's lips parted slightly, and out came a single low word, a whisper that chilled Dr. Hayden to his core. "Help!" It was the faintest of sounds, barely audible, but unmistakable. There was something wrong with the way the word hung in the air, something that made it feel far more sinister than any of the words he'd heard from patients waking up after surgery. Something wasn't right. Mark was supposed to be unconscious. The patient's body stiffened as though jerking from an unseen force. and Dr. Hayden's stomach churned in disbelief. It was as if Mark was fighting against something, some invisible force trying to hold him down. The room seemed to pulse with tension. Every breath felt harder to take. "Get him off the table," Dr. Hayden shouted, panicking, but the nurse remained still staring at the same corner of the room. She didn't respond. His hands shook as he looked back down at Mark. The man's eyes were wide open now, fully conscious, yet his body remained limp and unresponsive. It was impossible. Mark couldn't be awake. He couldn't be aware. Sedatives like that were too strong, too potent to wear off so quickly. And yet, here he was, staring up at him with an expression of sheer terror. Suddenly, the room lights flickered, plunging the operating room into near darkness. The hum of the machines ceased, and in the silence, Mark's lips parted once more. "Help me," he whispered again, but this time his voice was deeper, darker, distorted. Dr. Hayden staggered back, almost tripping over his own feet. The last thing Dr. Hayden remembered was his own scream, drowning in the unbearable sound of Mark's voice, one that didn't belong to a living person. The lights flickered once again, and then everything went black. When the authorities arrived later, they found Dr. Hayden unconscious on the floor of the operating room. Mark Simmons' body had vanished, leaving behind only an empty, blood-stained table. There were no records of his surgery, and no sign of a man named Mark Simmons anywhere in the hospital system. As though he had never existed at all. But Dr. Hayden knew better. He would never forget the haunting whispers or the terror in Mark's eyes. The eyes of someone who had died long before the surgery even began. The old amusement park had always intrigued Michael. He had heard the stories about it, how it had been abandoned decades ago, how no one ever dared to go near it. He was always curious about the past, about what things were like before the world moved on. So, one late evening, when he found himself driving through the rural outskirts, he couldn't resist the pull of the empty park, nestled between the overgrown trees, the rusted gates barely hanging on their hinges. With a sense of nervous excitement, Michael parked his car just outside the entrance. The sky had already darkened, and the wind picked up, rustling through the dying leaves. The air was thick with the scent of decay, like the park itself was holding its breath. He could hear the faint creaking of metal, the sound of a forgotten carousel turning in the wind. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, but he shook off the feeling. This was just a place, frozen in time. There was nothing to fear. As he stepped past the broken gates and into the park, a sense of unease settled in. The once bright colors of the rides had faded to dull shades, the murals on the walls peeling away. The place was a ghost town, untouched by human hands for years. Still, there was an eerie beauty to it, like a memory that had lingered too long, unwilling to leave. Michael walked deeper, past the dilapidated roller coaster, the rusting Ferris wheel, and the empty game booths. But as he approached the center of the park, something caught his eye. It was the carousel. Despite the years of neglect, the carousel was still intact, its colorful horses still standing in place, frozen mid-ride. But there was something wrong. The music. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind, but it was unmistakable, the haunting, sweet melody of a carousel playing. And it wasn't coming from the speakers. It was coming from somewhere within the ride itself. Michael's pulse quickened. The carousel was broken. He knew that. The power was long gone. Yet the music played on. It was soft at first, like a lullaby, but with every passing second, it grew louder, more insistent, until it felt as if the park itself was alive. Michael hesitated, his mind screaming at him to leave, to turn around and drive as far away from this place as possible. But his feet betrayed him, pulling him forward to the carousel, to the source of the haunting sound. The closer he got, the more he could make out the shapes on the ride. They were not the usual colorful horses that would have once been there. These were figures, dark and twisted, the horses now grotesque, their eyes wide open and unblinking, their smiles too sharp, too wide. He stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding in his chest. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stared at them. The figures didn't move, but the music continued, louder now, almost deafening. A cold chill ran down Michael's spine. He tried to turn and run, but his legs wouldn't move. The sound of the carousel spinning grew louder and faster. The figure's eyes seemed to follow him, their smiles widening ever so slightly, as if they were watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. Then he saw something that made his stomach churn. In the reflection of one of the cracked mirrors near the ride, he saw a figure standing at the edge of the carousel. A man, tall and thin, dressed in an old, tattered suit, his face obscured by a dark, wide-brimmed hat. Michael felt a bead of cold sweat trickle down his neck. He blinked and looked back at the man, but the figure was gone. The reflection, however, remained. The music grew louder, and Michael felt as though it was vibrating through his bones, filling his body with a sense of terror he couldn't shake. It wasn't just the carousel anymore. The park itself was alive. He could feel the ground beneath him shifting, as if something was moving below, something ancient and forgotten. The once dormant rides began to creak and groan, as if stirred from a long slumber. The Ferris wheel, which had been still for decades, shuddered to life, its lights flickering, casting long, distorted shadows across the park. The game's booths rumbled as if something inside them was moving, waiting. Michael stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest, but before he could run, the carousel's music stopped. And then, silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. Michael felt the weight of it pressing down on him, like the entire park was closing in around him. He didn't dare move. He was trapped in the stillness, every muscle in his body frozen in fear. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence. Low, raspy, as if it was coming from the very earth beneath him. "Why did you come here?" it whispered. Michael's breath caught in his throat as the ground beneath him shifted. The carousel began to move again, slowly at first, but then faster and faster, the figures on the ride twisting, turning, their heads jerking toward him, their eyes glowing red. The music resumed, now distorted, warped, as if it had been taken over by something dark. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The park had come alive. And it was no longer just a forgotten relic of the past. It had been waiting for someone to return. And now that someone was him. With a final scream of terror, Michael ran, but the ground seemed to twist beneath his feet. The carousel spun faster, the shadows reaching for him, and the dark figure in the hat reappeared in front of him, blocking his escape. His blood ran cold as he realized he had made a fatal mistake. The park had claimed him, just as it had claimed countless others before him. The carousel's music echoed in the distance as Michael's screams were swallowed by the night. And in the darkness, the park waited, once again, for its next victim. The church had been abandoned for decades, its towering bell spire silhouetted against the night sky like a forgotten relic. No one in town went near it. The doors were locked, the windows covered in grime, and the foundation was crumbling. But every night at exactly 4 a.m., the bells would ring. At first, people thought it was the wind. Then, they blamed pranksters. But the police never found anyone, and the mechanism to ring the bells had long since rusted over. Yet, the bells never missed a night. One night, Daniel, a journalist, decided to investigate. He had heard the stories growing up, the eerie sound of bells in the dead of night, the shadows that moved in the high windows, the rumors that no priest had ever left that church alive. Most people in town had learned to ignore it, to stay in their homes and pretend the bells didn't exist. But Daniel wanted the truth. Armed with his camera and flashlight, he walked up the cracked steps leading to the church's entrance. The heavy wooden doors groaned under his touch, but wouldn't budge. He moved along the side of the building, finding a broken window just big enough to slip through. The glass crunched under his boots as he landed inside. The air was thick with dust and decay. Wooden pews, long abandoned, were covered in white sheets, giving them the eerie appearance of shrouded figures. The altar stood at the far end, the once brilliant stained glass behind it dulled with age. But it was the silence that unsettled him most. He checked his phone, 3:50 a.m. The bells would ring soon. His breath quickened as he moved toward the bell tower's spiral staircase, his flashlight casting long, twisting shadows on the walls. The wood creaked beneath him, and for a moment he thought he heard another set of footsteps. He froze, turning quickly. Nothing. Just the empty pews below. The air shifted. It felt heavy, charged like the moments before a storm. Daniel continued up, heart pounding. He reached the top, stepping into the belfry. The massive bell loomed above him, unmoving, covered in cobwebs. The ropes that once controlled it were cut, frayed edges swaying slightly in the breeze that filtered through the broken tower window. And yet, dong! The sound nearly knocked him off his feet. His ears rang as the bell swung, though no one had touched it. Dong! The force of it rattled the walls, dust and debris raining from the ceiling. Daniel stumbled back, pressing himself against the stone railing. The final toll echoed through the empty town below. And then, silence. Daniel's hands trembled as he lifted his camera, snapping a photo of the swinging bell. But when he looked at the preview screen, his blood ran cold. There was something standing behind him. A figure draped in tattered robes, its face hidden in shadow, its long fingers stretching toward him. He spun around. Nothing, just the empty tower. His breath came in shallow gasps. He had to get out. Now. As he turned to descend the stairs, something stopped him. The dust on the floor, untouched for decades, had footprints. Not just one set, dozens. And they all led to the edge of the tower. His head swam. It didn't make sense. The town had been abandoned. No one had entered this church in years. But someone, or something, had been here. The bells rang again. This time, Daniel ran. By the time he reached the broken window, he didn't stop. He jumped through, hitting the ground outside with a hard thud. Pain shot up his arm, but he didn't care. He scrambled to his feet, sprinting down the road, away from the cursed building. The bells had never rung twice before. The next morning, Daniel checked his footage. The video was mostly static, the sound distorted beyond recognition. But there was one clear moment, just a second of clarity before the footage cut out. A voice, barely a whisper, beneath the final toll of the bell. You shouldn't have come. It wasn't until she walked into the old house that Emma felt the weight of the world pressing down on her chest. The air was thick with something that couldn't quite be explained, a palpable presence that sent shivers down her spine. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in the small town knew about the house at the end of the street. The locals warned her, don't go near it, stay away from the old house. But Emma, ever the curious type, dismissed their warnings. She was fascinated by the history behind it. When Emma first moved to town, she was eager to explore, to uncover the secrets that the townspeople so desperately tried to avoid. And the old house, dark, decaying, with windows that seemed to watch you, was at the top of her list. It had stood there for decades, abandoned, its reputation more terrifying than its actual state. The stories surrounding it were twisted, some claiming that it was haunted, others that something far worse lurked there. One evening when the sky hung heavy with clouds and the wind whispered ominously, Emma finally decided to see for herself. The house was at the end of a long, winding road. It loomed in the distance, its silhouette barely visible against the murky sky. As she approached, her breath seemed to freeze in her chest. The feeling in the air grew denser, thicker, as though the house itself was trying to pull her in. Ignoring the rising unease in her stomach, Emma pushed open the gate. The rusty hinges screamed in protest. She stepped onto the front porch, her footsteps crunching over the dead leaves scattered across the floor. She noticed the door was ajar, a sliver of blackness beckoning her inside. Without a second thought, Emma crossed the threshold. Inside, the house was even worse than she imagined. The walls were crumbling, the floorboards creaked under her weight, and the air smelled stale, damp, like something had been rotting for years. The silence was oppressive. Every step she took seemed to echo throughout the house. But there was something else. In the far corner of the room, just beyond the entrance, Emma spotted a faint movement. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a trick of the light. Someone or something was there. Her breath caught in her throat as she took a cautious step forward. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make her question her sanity. Was someone else in the house? Or was it just her mind playing tricks on her? She hesitated but pressed on, the need to uncover the truth outweighing the terror rising within her. As she made her way deeper into the house, the temperature seemed to drop. Her skin prickled as the silence deepened. The movement came again, this time more pronounced. From the corner of the room, something emerged, a figure, but not a human figure. Emma's breath hitched. It was a man, or at least it looked like a man. His body was hunched, his skin unnaturally pale, as though it had been drained of life. His eyes were wide and dark, hollow pits that seemed to stare right through her. He didn't move, only stood there, watching her with an intensity that felt suffocating. For a moment, Emma stood frozen in place. Then she turned and ran. She bolted for the door, but as she reached for the handle, the man's voice echoed in her ears. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't even a shout. It was as if the voice came from within her own mind. Don't leave. I've been waiting for you. She spun around in horror, but the figure was gone. The room was empty, but the door wouldn't open. She twisted the handle desperately, but it was stuck, as though the house itself was holding her inside. Her pulse pounded in her ears, and panic surged through her veins. She pushed harder, yanking at the door, but it refused to budge. And then, she heard it again. A soft, deliberate tapping. It came from the walls, from the floorboards, from above. The house was alive. With every tap, the sound grew louder, closer, as if something was crawling through the walls toward her. Something was coming, and it wasn't going to let her leave. Finally, with a final desperate push, Emma wrenched the door open and stumbled outside. She ran, not looking back until she reached the street, gasping for breath. The house loomed behind her, silent once more, as though nothing had ever happened. But Emma knew better. The house had seen her, and now it would never let her go. The first time Sarah saw the mannequin move, she convinced herself it was just her imagination. She had been working the closing shift at the department store for weeks, and exhaustion played cruel tricks on the mind. But that night, as she did her final rounds, she swore she saw it. Just a slight shift, a twitch in the fingers, the tilt of its head. She laughed it off, shaking her head. I need sleep, she thought. But the feeling lingered. The next night, it happened again. Sarah had been restocking shelves when she glanced up at the row of mannequins in the display window. They stood there, motionless as always, pale, plastic faces frozen in eerie perfection. But something was wrong. She was sure she had left them in different poses. One in particular had turned slightly, just enough that its blank face was now staring directly at her. A shiver crawled down her spine. She was alone in the store. She had been for the past hour. No one could have moved them. Still, she forced herself to brush it off. Maybe she had just forgotten their original positions. Maybe her mind was playing tricks on her again. But the unease grew. By the third night, she started feeling watched. The security cameras were old, the grainy footage barely clear enough to make out details. But when she checked them during her break, something made her blood run cold. Between two frames, less than a second apart, one of the mannequins had shifted. Its arm had moved. Its head had turned. Sarah stared at the screen, unblinking. That's impossible. Her first instinct was to check the display in person. She told herself there had to be a logical explanation. But as she walked toward the mannequins, dread coiled in her stomach. The store was eerily silent, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly above her. The closer she got, the heavier the air felt. She stopped in front of the display. They were standing there, lifeless. But then, one of them wasn't where it had been before. She backed away, heart hammering. She wasn't going crazy. Something was wrong. She decided to test it. That night, before she locked up, she placed a mannequin in a very specific pose. She positioned its arms, tilted its head to one side, and took a picture on her phone for proof. Then she left. When she returned the next evening, the store was exactly as she had left it. Except for one thing. The mannequin. It had moved. It was no longer in the pose she had placed it in. Now, its head was completely straight, facing forward, staring directly at her. A cold dread settled in her bones. Sarah wanted to leave, to quit on the spot. But she needed this job. She decided to keep her distance. As long as she didn't touch them, as long as she ignored stop. It didn't. The mannequins kept shifting, slowly, subtly, sometimes just an inch, sometimes more. She would turn her back for a second, and when she looked again, something was different. And then, one night, it went too far. She was alone, as always, closing up for the night. She had been avoiding looking at the mannequins altogether. But when she walked past the display window, something made her glance up. And that's when she saw it. One of the mannequins wasn't standing anymore. It was crawling. On its hands and knees, its stiff plastic fingers digging into the floor, its head twisted at an unnatural angle. Sarah let out a strangled scream, stumbling back. Her hands shook as she scrambled for her phone, trying to call someone, anyone. But before she could press a single button, the store lights flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, she heard it. A sharp plastic click, like a limb snapping into place. When the lights came back on, the mannequin was standing again, right against the glass. Sarah ran. She never came back. The store closed down a month later. No one knew why. But sometimes when people walk by at night, they swear they see something. A mannequin pressed against the glass, watching. The sound of the wind howling outside the car was deafening, but it didn't compare to the noise coming from the back seat. At first, Chloe thought it was just her imagination, the kind of eerie feeling that creeps up on you when you're alone on an empty highway at midnight. But then she heard it again, a soft, unnerving giggle, almost like the whisper of a child. She glanced nervously in the rearview mirror, but the back seat was empty. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the sensation. "You're just tired," she muttered under her breath. It had been a long day, and she was driving through the rural back roads to get home after a visit to her parents. There were no other cars on the road, no lights, just the oppressive darkness, and the occasional flicker of her headlights illuminating the narrow path ahead. But the sound came again, a high-pitched giggle that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. This time, it was accompanied by the unmistakable sensation of someone breathing. Chloe's heart skipped a beat. She whipped her head around, but still, there was no one there. Her mind was racing, trying to explain away the sound, but there was no logical reason for it. The hairs on her arms were prickling with an overwhelming sense of dread. Chloe's foot pressed down on the gas pedal, the engine roaring to life as she sped up, hoping to escape whatever was haunting her. But no matter how fast she went, the sensation only grew stronger, as if whatever was in the back seat was keeping pace with her. The giggling had stopped, but now there was something far worse. A whispering, low and menacing. It sounded like it was right behind her ear, though the seat was still empty. "Turn around," the voice breathed, so faint, so chilling that it sent a jolt of terror straight to her core. "Turn around, Chloe." Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tight, her knuckles went white. She knew she should pull over, should call someone, but every fiber of her being screamed to just keep going. The voice was almost a whisper now, but its urgency was unmistakable. "Turn around," it repeated, this time louder, more insistent, as if the words were being etched into her brain. Chloe could feel the panic rising in her chest. Was she losing her mind? Or was someone really in the back seat, playing a twisted game with her? Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again, this time scanning the dark interior of the car more thoroughly. That's when she saw it. A pale face, just barely visible in the corner of the reflection. It was a child's face, staring at her with wide, hollow eyes, its lips twisted into a grotesque grin. Chloe gasped and slammed her foot on the brake. The car screeched to a halt, throwing her body forward against the seatbelt. She quickly looked behind her, but the back seat was completely empty. Her pulse was hammering in her chest as she fumbled for her phone. Her hands were shaking so violently that it took her several tries to unlock it. She needed to call someone, anyone. But when she pulled up her contacts, something stopped her. Her heart froze. There was a new message in her inbox, a single line of text that made her blood run cold. "Turn around, Chloe." Her breath caught in her throat as she looked up. There, standing at the edge of the road, was a figure. A child. The same child from the back seat, only now it was standing in front of her car, eyes wide, staring at her with that same eerie grin. Panic surged through her as Chloe floored the gas pedal again, the tires screeching as she swerved around the figure. She didn't dare look back. The car rattled down the dark road, and Chloe's mind raced with confusion and fear. Was it a prank? Was someone messing with her? But she had no time to think about that. All she could focus on was the overwhelming need to get home. As the miles passed, the night seemed to grow darker, the road longer. But then, through the corner of her eye, Chloe saw something impossible. A flicker of movement. The child from earlier, standing by the side of the road, staring at her again, as if waiting. She sped up again, but the further she drove, the more she saw them. Figures, standing along the roadside, watching her, their faces pale and blank, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The giggling returned, louder now, echoing through the car. and then she heard it, clearer than before. The voice. "Don't run, Chloe. We're already here." She slammed the brakes again, heart racing, only to find herself in the same spot she had been before. The road, the figures, the child with the unnerving grin. Chloe's breath hitched as she realized she was trapped. The road was endless, looping back on itself. The last thing she saw before everything went black were the glowing eyes of the child, slowly inching toward the car, that cold, malicious smile spreading wider with every passing second.
The man who had never quite felt at home in the city was eager for a fresh start. The apartment he had secured was in a small, sleepy neighborhood on the outskirts, just far enough away from the bustle to offer peace and quiet. It was one of those places that people typically passed by without ever noticing. To him, it felt like the perfect spot to escape the stress of his old life. As he moved in, there was a peculiar sense of optimism that washed over him. The apartment was older, the walls thin, the floors creaky, but everything felt simple and normal. No extravagant details, no modern upgrades, but that was what he liked about it. It was quaint. It was home. However, as the days passed, he began to notice odd things. At night, when he lay in bed, there was a strange creaking sound, like someone was walking through the hallway, though he knew there was no one else in the building. At first, he thought it was just the building settling, but over time, the sounds seemed to take on a rhythm, as though they were following some sort of pattern. He'd hear the footsteps move closer to his door, pause for a moment, then retreat back down the hallway. Every time, his heart would race as he pulled the blanket over his head, trying to convince himself it was just his imagination. One evening, after returning home late from work, he was especially exhausted. The creaking noises had been happening again, this time louder than before, and it seemed as if they were coming from directly outside his door. Frustrated, he stood up, grabbed a flashlight, and opened his door. His eyes scanned the hallway, but there was nothing there, no one in sight. Just the dimly lit hallway, the same as it had always been. He shrugged and closed the door behind him, but as he was about to walk back to his room, the doorbell rang. It was late, far too late for any visitors. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was just past midnight. Hesitantly, he opened the door, expecting to find no one there. But to his surprise, there was a figure standing on the other side, cloaked in darkness. The figure was tall, wearing a hood, their face obscured by shadows. Before he could speak, the figure handed him a small package. It was wrapped in brown paper, and there was no return address. The figure said nothing, just nodded, and turned, walking away, down the hallway, without another word. Confused, he brought the package inside, and closed the door behind him. The moment the door clicked shut, a strange sensation filled the room. It was like a thick, suffocating silence had settled over the apartment. He could hear his heart pounding in his chest as he stared at the package, wondering what it could possibly be. Slowly, he unwrapped it, his hands trembling slightly. Inside, there was an old, weathered photograph, one that seemed to be decades old. It was a picture of a family, smiling happily, in front of a house that looked suspiciously like his own. His stomach dropped as he looked closer. The family in the picture wasn't his. In fact, he didn't recognize any of the people. But what caught his eye was the man standing at the far right of the photograph. He had the same dark eyes, the same messy hair, the same sharp features as the man himself. It was like staring at a ghost of his future self. The blood drained from his face. A cold shiver ran down his spine. He turned the photo over, hoping for an explanation, but there was nothing written on the back, just blank, faded paper. The next few nights were a blur of unsettling dreams and restless nights. Each time he tried to sleep, the sound of footsteps in the hallway would return, and sometimes, He could hear whispers, faint, indecipherable voices that seemed to speak his name. No matter how hard he tried to ignore it, the feeling of being watched never went away, and the photo was always there, haunting him, as if it was a reminder that something was wrong. He knew that the apartment was no longer his. He was a guest, a visitor, in someone else's home. Finally, he couldn't take it any longer. He decided to leave, to pack up, and find somewhere else to live. But as he stood in the hallway, ready to leave, something strange happened. The door to his apartment wouldn't open. No matter how much he turned the handle, it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through him. The hallway, which had once felt like a simple corridor, now felt like an endless maze. The walls seemed to close in on him, and the lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. He could hear footsteps again, but this time, they weren't coming from the hallway. They were coming from inside his apartment. He rushed back to the door, pulling at the handle with all his might, but it was no use. He was trapped. That's when the whisper came again, louder this time. "You're next." With trembling hands, he turned back to face the hallway. The figure that had left the package stood in the distance, watching him with cold, empty eyes. The door, which had once been his escape, now felt like the final trap. He realized too late that there was no way out. The apartment, the house, it had all been a part of something much darker, something far older, and now it had claimed him. As the figure drew closer, the whispers grew louder, drowning out all other sounds. The man realized, with a sickening clarity, that he was no longer in control of his fate. Whatever had been happening in that house, whatever had haunted its walls for so long, was now a part of him, and there would be no escape, not for him, not for anyone who came after. The child's voice echoed through the empty house, his words carrying a haunting sense of certainty. "They only come out when you blink." The babysitter had laughed at first, dismissing the child's warning as nothing more than the ramblings of a scared little boy. But as the evening wore on, something began to feel off. The house, once a familiar and comforting place, now felt different. It felt alive, as though the walls were watching her every move. At first, she dismissed the feeling as nerves. After all, she was just here to watch a kid for a few hours, get paid, and go home. But then the lights started flickering. It wasn't just the odd bulb going out. This was something else. The lights would flicker in a strange pattern, almost rhythmic, like some unseen force was playing with them. She checked the breakers, but they were fine. She went to the kitchen to grab a drink, and when she turned back, she found the hallway lights dimming to near darkness, and the child standing there, his face pale, eyes wide. "I told you," he whispered, his voice shaky. "They're waiting." She smiled, trying to reassure him, but there was something unsettling about the way he looked at her. His gaze was distant, unfocused, as if he were seeing something that wasn't there. She knelt down beside him, trying to keep things light. "Who's waiting, sweetie?" "The shadows," he said in a soft voice, his eyes not leaving her face. "They wait until you blink." She laughed again, though there was an edge to it now. She didn't know whether to be amused or worried. "It's just your imagination. There's nothing to be afraid of." But the air in the house was thick, heavy, and the longer she stayed, the more her nerves frayed. The sounds of footsteps came from somewhere deep within the house, echoing down the empty hallways. But when she checked, there was no one there. It was as though the house itself was breathing, alive, watching, waiting. She tried to brush it off. It had been a long day, and the thought of going home to a quiet apartment sounded comforting. The clock ticked loudly as she glanced at it, realizing that hours had passed, though it had felt like mere minutes. The child had grown increasingly restless, his eyes flicking back and forth, scanning the shadows, as though something invisible was moving around them. He stood up suddenly, his small frame casting a long shadow. "You have to blink," he said. "You can't look at them too long." Confused, she turned back to him, but before she could respond, the room grew colder.
A sudden chill swept through the air, and she felt it, a pressure on her chest, as if the house itself was holding its breath. And then, she blinked. The sound that followed was deafening. It was as though the world had been holding its breath, and with her blink, it exhaled. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch and writhe, growing darker, more defined. She heard something, or someone, moving behind her. She whipped around, but the child was gone. The house was empty, but the shadows weren't. They were closer now, crawling toward her, their shapes indistinguishable from the darkness around them. The walls seemed to close in, as if the house itself was shrinking, trapping her. She tried to run, but her legs felt heavy, as though they were sinking into the floor. And then, the whispers came. "Blink again," they said. "You have to blink again." But it was too late. He stood there, frozen in place, his eyes locked onto the man in the mirror. It wasn't his reflection. It couldn't be. There was something wrong with the face staring back at him. It was too pale, too lifeless, with eyes that seemed to burn into his soul. The smile, if it could be called that, was crooked and unnervingly wide. His heart raced, but no matter how much he tried, he couldn't look away. It was as if the reflection was drawing him in, compelling him to stay, to watch, to acknowledge whatever it was that lurked beneath the surface. He stepped back, and the reflection did the same. He stepped forward, and the reflection did the same. No matter what he did, the figure in the mirror mirrored his every move. It was him, but not him. Something was horribly wrong. And then, the smile grew wider.
The rain had been falling for hours, a steady rhythmic patter that seemed to echo through the dense forest. The trees stood tall and ancient, their gnarled branches twisting toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. Or so it seemed. Emma had always loved the forest. It was her escape, her sanctuary. But tonight, something felt different. The forest felt alive, in a way she couldn't quite explain. She pulled her raincoat tighter around her and adjusted the strap of her backpack, her flashlight cutting through the darkness as she trudged along the muddy path. She had taken this trail countless times before, but tonight it felt unfamiliar, as if the trees themselves had shifted to confuse her. The whispers started softly, almost imperceptible beneath the sound of the rain. At first Emma thought it was just the wind, a trick of her imagination, but as she walked deeper into the forest, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were coming from the trees. She stopped in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. The whispers were faint, like the rustling of leaves, but they were unmistakably voices. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was eerie, almost mournful. She shone her flashlight at the nearest tree, its bark rough and weathered, and for a moment, she thought she saw something move in the shadows. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling, till the whispers stopped abruptly, and the forest fell silent, except for the rain. Emma stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She told herself it was just the wind, just her mind playing tricks on her, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. She forced herself to keep walking, her boots squelching in the mud. The whispers started again, louder this time, and she could almost make out the words. They were speaking in a language she didn't understand, but there was something familiar about it, something that sent a chill down her spine. The path ahead was barely visible through the rain, and Emma's flashlight flickered, casting long wavering shadows on the trees. She shook it, and the light steadied, but the shadows seemed to linger, moving independently of the light. She quickened her pace, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The whispers were all around her now, coming from every direction, and she could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on her. She stumbled over a root and fell to her knees, her hands sinking into the cold, wet mud. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and she clapped her hands over her ears, trying to block them out. But they weren't coming from outside her head, they were inside her mind, echoing in her thoughts, and she couldn't escape them. "Stop!" she screamed, her voice breaking. The whispers stopped again, and the forest was eerily silent. Emma stayed on her knees, her chest heaving, her hands trembling. She didn't know how long she stayed like that, but eventually she forced herself to stand. She had to get out of the forest. She had to get home. She started walking again, her flashlight beam bouncing off the trees. The whispers didn't return, but she could feel the forest watching her, the trees leaning in closer, their branches reaching out like claws. She tried to focus on the path, on putting one foot in front of the other, but the forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in around her. And then she saw it, a figure standing in the distance, just beyond the reach of her flashlight. It was tall and thin, its silhouette blending into the shadows of the trees. Emma's breath caught in her throat, and she stopped, her heart pounding. The figure didn't move, but she could feel its eyes on her, watching her. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaking. The figure didn't respond, but the whispers started again, louder and more urgent than before. This time she could understand them. "Leave," they said, their voices overlapping, a chorus of whispers that echoed in her mind. "Leave now, before it's too late." Emma's legs felt like they were made of lead, but she forced herself to move, to turn away from the figure, and run. The whispers followed her, growing louder and more frantic, and she could feel the forest closing in around her, the trees reaching out to grab her. She stumbled and fell, her flashlight slipping from her hand and rolling away, its beam flickering, and then going out. She was plunged into darkness, the rain falling harder now, soaking through her clothes. The whispers were deafening, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She scrambled to her feet, her hands groping blindly in the dark, and she felt something brush against her arm, cold and wet, like the bark of a tree. She screamed and ran, her feet slipping in the mud, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers were all around her, inside her, and she could feel the forest pulling her deeper, deeper into its embrace. She didn't know how long she ran, but eventually she burst out of the trees and into the open, the rain still falling, the whispers fading into the distance. She collapsed on the ground, her chest heaving, her body trembling. She was safe, she was out of the forest, but as she lay there, the rain washing over her, she couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't done with her. The whispers were gone, but she could still feel them, lingering in the back of her mind, waiting. The rain hammered against the windows of the old creaky house, a relentless downpour that seemed to echo the unease settling in Clara's chest. She had just moved into the house, a quaint but slightly decrepit Victorian home that had been in her family for generations. The house had been empty for decades, and the air inside was heavy with the scent of dust and decay. But it was the mirror that caught her attention the moment she stepped into the master bedroom. The mirror was an antique, its ornate frame carved with intricate patterns of twisting vines and strange, almost human-like faces. The glass was slightly warped, giving reflections a distorted, dreamlike quality. Clara had found it leaning against the wall, covered in a dusty sheet, and something about it had called to her. She couldn't explain it, but she felt compelled to keep it. That first night, as the rain poured outside, Clara stood in front of the mirror, brushing her hair. The reflection staring back at her was her own, but something felt off. The Clara in the mirror moved just a fraction of a second slower than she did, her smile a little too wide, her eyes a little too dark. Clara blinked, shook her head, and told herself it was just the warped glass playing tricks on her. But the next night,
It happened again. Clara was getting ready for bed when she noticed her reflection wasn't mimicking her movements. It stood still, staring at her with an expression that sent a chill down her spine. Clara froze, her heart pounding, and the reflection tilted its head, its smile widening unnaturally. Clara stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat, and the reflection returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. She told herself it was just her imagination, the stress of moving, the eerie atmosphere of the old house. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The mirror was wrong. It was alive. Over the next few days, Clara tried to avoid the mirror, but it was as if it had a hold on her. She found herself drawn to it, standing in front of it for hours, staring into the distorted glass. The reflection continued to act strangely, sometimes moving on its own, sometimes mimicking her actions with a delay that made her skin crawl. And then there were the whispers. At first they were faint, almost imperceptible, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But as the days passed, they grew louder, more distinct. The whispers were coming from the mirror, and they were speaking to her. "Let me out," the reflection said one night, its voice a low guttural growl that didn't match Clara's own. She stumbled back, her heart racing, but the reflection didn't stop. "Let me out, Clara. Let me take your place." Clara screamed and threw a blanket over the mirror, her hands trembling. She spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of the room, her eyes fixed on the covered mirror, afraid to look away. But the whispers didn't stop. They echoed in her mind, growing louder and more insistent, until she could barely think. The next morning, Clara decided she had to get rid of the mirror. She couldn't take it anymore. She called a local antique dealer, hoping to sell it. But when the man arrived, he took one look at the mirror and refused to touch it. "I'm sorry, miss," he said, his face pale. "There's something wrong with that mirror. I can't take it." Clara begged him to at least help her move it, but he refused, leaving her alone with the mirror and the whispers that never stopped. That night, Clara had a dream. She was standing in front of the mirror, but the reflection wasn't hers. It was a twisted, grotesque version of herself, its eyes black and hollow, its mouth stretched into a grin that showed too many teeth. The reflection reached out, its fingers pressing against the glass, and Clara woke up screaming, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she couldn't stay in the house any longer. She packed her bags, determined to leave the mirror behind. But as she turned to go, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold, the sound of glass cracking. She turned back to the mirror and saw a thin crack running down the center of the glass. The reflection was still there, staring at her with that same twisted grin. And then it spoke. "Too late, Clara," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "You should have let me out." The crack in the glass widened, and Clara watched in horror as the reflection stepped out of the mirror, its form shifting and distorting as it moved. It was no longer a reflection, it was real. Clara tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey her. She was frozen in place, her eyes locked on the thing that had emerged from the mirror. It moved closer, its movements jerky and unnatural, and Clara could feel its breath on her skin, cold and damp like the grave. "You don't belong here," it hissed, its voice a guttural growl. "This is my world now," Clara screamed, as the thing reached out, its fingers closing around her throat. She struggled, but it was too strong. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the mirror, its surface rippling like water, and the reflection of the thing standing over her, smiling. When Clara woke up, she was lying on the floor in front of the mirror. The crack was gone, and the glass was smooth and unbroken. She looked at her reflection, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. But then the reflection smiled, a slow, sinister smile that didn't reach its eyes. Clara stumbled back, her heart pounding, and the reflection laughed, a sound that echoed in her mind long after she fled the room. She tried to leave the house, but every time she reached the door, she found herself back in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. The whispers were louder now, more insistent, and Clara could feel the thing inside the mirror, waiting, watching, and then, one night, the mirror spoke again. "It's time, Clara," it said, its voice a low guttural growl. "Time to switch places." Clara tried to fight it, but the whispers were too loud, too overwhelming. She felt herself being pulled toward the mirror, her reflection reaching out to her, its fingers brushing against hers. And then, with a final, desperate scream, she was pulled into the mirror, the glass rippling like water, before settling back into place. The thing that had been trapped in the mirror stepped out, stretching its new form with a satisfied grin. It looked at the mirror, at the reflection of Clara trapped inside, and laughed. "Welcome to your new home," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "I hope you enjoy it as much as I did." And with that, it turned and walked away, leaving Clara trapped in the mirror, her screams echoing in the empty house. As the rain poured outside, the train rattled through the night, its wheels clacking against the tracks in a rhythmic, almost hypnotic pattern. The rain outside was relentless, hammering against the windows and blurring the world into a dark, shapeless void. Inside, the carriage was nearly empty, save for a few scattered passengers dozing in their seats. Among them was Daniel, a weary traveler on his way home after a long business trip. Daniel had always found trains soothing, especially at night. The gentle rocking, the sound of the rain, and the dim lighting created a sense of calm. But tonight, something felt off. The air was heavier, the silence more oppressive. He glanced around the carriage, his eyes landing on a figure sitting in the far corner. The figure was shrouded in shadow, its face obscured by the hood of a dark coat. Daniel couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, but something about the way it sat, perfectly still, unnaturally still, made his skin crawl. He tried to shake off the feeling, telling himself it was just another passenger, but the unease lingered. As the train continued its journey, Daniel noticed something strange. The figure never moved, not even a twitch. The other passengers shifted in their seats, coughed, or glanced at their phones, but the figure remained frozen, like a statue. Daniel's curiosity got the better of him, and he found himself staring, trying to make out any details in the dim light. That's when the figure turned its head. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as the figure's hood shifted, revealing a face that was impossibly pale, almost translucent. Its eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to stare right through him. Daniel quickly looked away, his heart pounding, but he could feel the figure's gaze burning into him. The whispers started soon after. At first, they were faint, barely audible, over the sound of the rain and the train, but as the minutes passed, they grew louder, more distinct. Daniel couldn't make out the words, but the tone was chilling, a low guttural murmur that sent shivers down his spine. He glanced around, trying to find the source, but the other passengers seemed oblivious. The whispers were coming from the figure. Daniel's hands trembled as he gripped the armrests of his seat. He wanted to move, to get as far away from the figure as possible, but his body refused to obey. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and he could feel them echoing in his mind, filling him with a sense of dread he couldn't explain. And then the figure stood up. Daniel's breath hitched as the figure slowly rose from its seat, its movement stiff and unnatural. It turned to face him, its hollow eyes locked onto his, and began to walk toward him. The whispers grew into a cacophony, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Daniel tried to scream, but no sound came out. He tried to move, but his body was paralyzed. The figure stopped in front of him, its face inches from his, and leaned in close. Daniel could feel its breath, cold and damp like the grave, and the whispers became a single, clear voice. "You shouldn't have gotten on this train," it said, its voice a guttural growl that didn't sound human. "This train doesn't take the living." Daniel's vision blurred as the figure reached out, its bony fingers closing around his throat. The last thing he saw, before everything went black, was the figure's face, its hollow eyes staring into his soul, and the faint reflection of the train's other passengers in the window, all of them staring at him with the same hollow eyes. When Daniel woke up, he was alone in the carriage. The rain had stopped, and the train was silent. He stumbled to his feet, his heart racing, and looked around. The figure was gone, but the whispers lingered in his mind, a constant reminder of what had happened. He never spoke of that night to anyone, but he never took the train again. And sometimes, late at night, he would hear the whispers, faint but unmistakable, calling him back to the train that didn't take the living. The rain had been falling for hours, a steady, unrelenting downpour that turned the streets into rivers and the world into a blur of grey. Sarah had been walking for what felt like forever, her umbrella doing little to protect her from the storm. She was soaked to the bone, her clothes clinging to her skin, but she didn't care. She just wanted to get home. As she turned the corner onto her street, she saw it, a shadowy figure standing under a street lamp, its form distorted by the rain. Sarah stopped in her tracks, her heart skipping a beat. The figure was tall and thin, its features obscured by the darkness and the rain. It didn't move, didn't react to her presence. It just stood there, watching. Sarah told herself it was just a trick of the light, a figment of her imagination. But as she took a step forward, the figure turned its head, and she could feel its gaze on her, cold and unyielding. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding, but the figure didn't move. It just watched her, its presence like a weight pressing down on her chest. When she reached her house, she fumbled with her keys, her hands trembling. She could still feel the figure's gaze on her, even though she couldn't see it anymore. She finally got the door open and rushed inside, slamming it shut behind her. She leaned against the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and told herself she was safe. But she wasn't. The next night, the rain returned, and so did the figure. Sarah saw it standing under the same street lamp, its form just as distorted as before. This time, she didn't stop. She ran, her heart pounding, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. But no matter how fast she ran, the figure was always there, always watching. The nights turned into weeks, and the figure became a constant presence in Sarah's life. It was always there, standing under the street lamp, watching her, with its cold, unyielding gaze. She tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself it wasn't real, but the weight of its presence was unbearable. And then, one night, the figure moved. Sarah was walking home, her umbrella clutched tightly in her hand, when she saw the figure step out from under the street lamp. It moved slowly, its movement stiff and unnatural, and began to walk toward her. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and she turned to run, but the figure was faster. It was in front of her, in an instant, its face inches from hers. Sarah screamed, but no sound came out. The figure reached out, its fingers cold and bony, and touched her face. The world around her blurred, and she felt herself being pulled into the darkness, the rain, and the street lamp fading away. When she woke up, she was standing under the street lamp, the rain falling around her. She looked down at her hands, and they were pale and translucent, like the figure's. She tried to move, but her body was stiff, unnatural. And then she saw her, a woman walking down the street, her umbrella clutched tightly in her hand. Sarah tried to call out, to warn her, but no sound came out. She could only watch as the woman approached, her heart pounding in her chest. And then she realized the truth. She was the shadow in the rain. The diary was old, its leather cover cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age. Emily had found it in the attic of her new house, tucked away in a dusty box filled with forgotten trinkets. She hadn't thought much of it at first, but something about it had called to her. She couldn't explain it, but she felt compelled to read it. The diary belonged to a woman named Margaret, who had lived in the house decades ago. The entries were written in a neat flowing script, and they detailed Margaret's life, her thoughts, her dreams, her fears. But as Emily read further, she noticed something strange. The entries began to change. Margaret wrote about sleepwalking, about waking up in strange places, with no memory of how she got there. She wrote about the whispers she heard in the night, the shadows that moved in the corners of her vision, and then she wrote about the diary itself. The diary knows, Margaret wrote. It knows where I go at night. It knows what I do. Emily felt a chill run down her spine as she read the words. She told herself it was just the ramblings of a disturbed mind, but the unease lingered. That night, she dreamed of Margaret, of walking through the house in a trance, the whispers guiding her steps. When she woke up, she was standing in the attic, the diary clutched in her hands. Emily's heart raced as she looked around, trying to make sense of what had happened. She had no memory of coming to the attic, no memory of anything after falling asleep. She stumbled back to her room, her hands trembling, and opened the diary. A new entry had been written. Emily, it read, "You shouldn't have read the diary. Now it knows you too." The rain had been falling for weeks, a relentless downpour that showed no signs of stopping. The town was drowning, the streets turned into rivers, the houses slowly being swallowed by the rising water. But the rain wasn't the worst part. The creatures were. They emerged from the flooded areas, their forms twisted and grotesque, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They moved through the water with ease, their presence like a shadow over the town. No one knew where they had come from, but everyone knew they were dangerous. Sarah had been trapped in her house for days, the water rising higher and higher. She had seen the creatures outside, their glowing eyes watching her from the darkness. She had tried to call for help, but the phones were dead, the power was out, and the town was cut off from the world. And then the whispers started. At first they were faint, barely audible over the sound of the rain, but as the days passed, they grew louder, more distinct. Sarah couldn't make out the words, but the tone was chilling, a low guttural murmur that sent shivers down her spine. The whispers were coming from the creatures. Sarah's hands trembled as she peered out the window, the creatures' glowing eyes staring back at her. She could feel their presence, like a weight pressing down on her chest, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. And then the door opened. Sarah's breath hitched as the water rushed in, the creatures following close behind. She tried to run, but the water was too high, the creatures too fast. They surrounded her, their glowing eyes locked onto hers, and the whispers became a single clear voice. "You shouldn't have stayed," it said, its voice a guttural growl that didn't sound human. The rain never stops. Sarah's vision blurred as the creatures reached out, their cold, bony fingers closing around her throat. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the creature's glowing eyes, staring into her soul, and the rain still falling, still drowning the world.